Welcome to another Uncanny episode of Ancient Geeks, the podcast about two geeks of a certain age reflecting on their younger selves, discovering geek culture when all this geekery was new. To me, my geek men, I'm your co-host, Tom Grant.
And I'm your co-host, Stephen Taylor.
And today, if you didn't get the hint already, we're going to talk about the Uncanny X-Men, specifically about the new X-Men that started in the 1970s and became a sensation in comic book fandom, and also was a little bit revolutionary in ways that we'll talk about. So that's our subject today. But before we get into that, so what have you been doing geek-wise lately, Stephen?
So I think the thing that I will highlight is because it's not quite genre, but it's close because we talked about variety shows last week. My wife and I went to Atlanta over the weekend and we saw Paul F. Tompkins' traveling variety show Varietopia, which
Hmm.
proved to me that you can do a variety show that's not ridiculous. It was great. Paul F. Tompkins is an improviser, comedian, actor who some people may know from podcasts and TV. But if you happen to have the chance to see it, I would recommend it.
Okay. And I would also recommend, like, if you ever get a chance to see Steve Martin and Martin Short together on
Oh,
stage,
yes,
yeah,
we
that's
have
also
that too. It's
another variety show that works.
fantastic stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what I've been doing, so after our monster movie episode last week, I went and read up on some other people's reviews of the movies that we talked about, and had a good time doing that. Got some background on some of these films I hadn't heard before. I also have been reading some solar punk, which is a
Okay.
subgenre of science fiction that a friend had recommended. So I've been, started a novella and probably will read some short stories after that.
Interesting. I've never heard of it.
Yeah. All right. So what's our soundtrack for this episode about the uncanny X-Men of the 1970s?
Well, I think clearly the only song that comes to mind is the cartoon theme song
Yeah.
from the 1990s. It just rolls around in your head. Um,
It is
and I
definitely an
realize
earworm.
oh yes, and I cannot remember really, and I meant to look but didn't do what the X-Men movies soundtrack sounded like. I don't remember there being a theme that stuck in my head from
No,
those
not at
movies.
all. Not like the cartoon.
No,
No. So listeners, go listen to that if you get a chance.
it'll get
It
stuck in
just
your head.
it's perfect comic book theme music, I think,
Yes, it is, and
particularly for the era.
yeah, and I would even say, just since it kind of that's really where I know it from more, is the HBO X-Men 97 cartoon, which uses that theme song, is
Right.
worth your time.
Okay. All right. So back in the 1970s, uh, the X-Men wouldn't say that they got rebooted. I kind of hate that word, rebooted. That they had a revival. And before we get into the specifics of it, how did you discover the new X-Men?
So this required an interesting sort of a little bit of research on my own, trying to figure this out. When did I and what did I remember about this? And as I had told you offline, I think that this is one of those cases where age differential really comes into play. I really started seriously collecting comics. That is going to the comic shop with the subscriptions and getting them in the back, really probably around 81. I had read comics, but I hadn't really collected comics. And I did not initially read the X-Men. I think I started buying them new probably somewhere around 145,
Hmm.
somewhere in there, which is actually look, obviously Chris Claremont's writing them. Dave Cockrum had come back to do the art at that point for a while. So I kind of associated even then Cockrum with the X-Men. And I remember finding the episode Phoenix Must Die in one of those piles of ratty comics. It was too bad that they were so messed up they didn't get bagged.
Hmm.
And I think that may be really what got me hooked on the X-Men at that point. But then it became this quest to go back and find things, which was a challenge. I know that so my early experience was not what we're about to talk about, and I didn't read, like I read Giant Size X-Men #1 as a reprint at some point, but it was all kind of a good example of how early comic collecting was a quest to try to
Right.
find these things that I really fell in love with. How about you?
So for me, it was much easier, less archaeology involved. My family had the bookstore slash comic store. Uh, we had customers like you who had subscriptions, and Giant Size X-Men #1 came out. So just a little background for people who aren't Marvel Comics fans. The X-Men are a super team of mutants. They have superpowers because of their mutations. There was a at the beginning of like Marvel Comics, when Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Thor, other comics that we've talked about got started, there were also the X-Men. It was also a Lee and Kirby kind of production, and eventually like a transition to other writers and other artists. It was never like my favorite title. In fact, I don't think I read all of them. I kind of dipped in and out, as issues became available. There was a really good run by Neil Adams as an
Yes.
artist near the end of the first official X-Men, and they went into reprints for a while and then just disappeared
Right. Right.
because it just wasn't popular enough for Marvel Comics to continue. So when there was going to be a new X-Men with announced that it was going to be a mix of old characters, new characters. When it came out, I was like, well, I definitely want to read this, and it was really clear from the moment that I read the first issue that it was something exceptional, right?
Right.
This was probably going to be really good, and it did not disappoint. So that's kind of how I discovered it. And if I might continue, I'm going to opine for a little bit here. If that's okay.
Oh, pine away.
Opine away. It was a sort of a stale time for Marvel Comics superhero characters at this time. So, there was still the machinery of publication was running. They would churn out issues with Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and the Avengers. It wasn't the greatest time creatively for them. The writing was okay, kind of, going over the same characters, the same plots, and so forth. The art was kind of, for the most part, it was kind of a little bit meh. Um, there were some other heroes on the fringes, and other titles on the fringes. This is, like when Jim Starlin started working in Marvel and is doing some great stuff. Even like the introduction of World War II era Golden Age heroes with the Invaders was interesting. So it wasn't all bad, but it wasn't like the peak of superhero comics at Marvel. Actually, the kind of titles that were dominating at the time, surprisingly, were horror comics. So you had Man Thing, Tomb of Dracula, Werewolf by Night, Ghost Rider, Son of Satan, who really was the son of Satan. That these were some of the more popular comics at the time. He also had like a couple of martial arts titles because Kung Fu was
Right.
a big deal. So you had Master of Kung Fu and Iron Fist. You had Luke Cage as a hero that was kind of contemporary then. You had an oddball super team that was kind of set up to be oddball, the Defenders,
Hmm.
that was, not as kind of not as well known in the Marvel universe as the Avengers were. They weren't like people said, "Oh, look, here come the Defenders." I mean, they were, kind of a little bit more subterranean in how they operated, and it was an odd mix of characters. Howard the
Which
Duck.
included the Defenders had some of the original X-Men in them, did they not? Was not
Oh
the
yeah,
Angel?
yeah. Eventually, yeah, Angel was in
Yeah.
it. I think Iceman. No,
I
Iceman was in
think
the
you.
Champions.
Oh, that's right. Champions was the other. That's the one I actually am thinking
Yeah,
Champions. But
Champions.
yeah, Champions, yeah, because that was Hercules and I think that's where the
Yeah,
Angel and Iceman
yeah. The
were.
Iceman and Iceman.
That's
That's
right.
right.
Another
Um,
weird team up book.
Yeah, highly popular was also Howard the Duck.
Yes.
This kind of oddball character. I'm using oddball a lot. This very tongue-in-cheek character that occasionally encountered some of the heroes of the Marvel Universe and often was doing wacky stuff on his own. Black and white magazines were a thing, so
Mhm.
kind of bigger format. Savage Sword of Conan. There was a Hulk magazine. There were other magazines that they did, and probably one of the other big things at the time was Conan the Barbarian. right? Yeah, so Conan was still both in the regular format comics as well as the black and
Mhm.
white comics. So that's kind of was the state of Marvel at the time that the X-Men came out. Did you ever kind of go back and read all those horror
So
comics or
I
the
never did the horror
Defenders or
comics.
okay.
I read some of the Defenders, like I said, the Champions. I obviously we've mentioned in passing all the Starlin stuff. I appealed to me. I read all, went back and found all that. And there's some good stuff with the Avengers going on during this period.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's the wacky part, and I'm continuing to sense an ongoing thesis of ancient geeks is that the '70s were weird, man.
Yeah.
And this is just another
Guess it
illustration
was. Guess
thereof,
it.
maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in fairness to the '70s, what we're talking about today is the mid '70s, and it is something that we quite liked. So there's that. There you go.
Yeah. So then all of a sudden comes along Giant Size X-Men #1, and then, the regular X-Men comic kind of picked up where that story left off. And do you want to give like a short synopsis of the Giant Size X-Men #1 for people who haven't read it?
Sure. I mean, basically, it's a pretty straightforward story. Essentially, Professor Xavier, Charles Xavier, Professor X from the original X-Men comic, is out looking for to assemble a new team of X-Men because the original X-Men have been captured by a living island. Um, so it really is this sort of almost like assembling the Dirty Dozen kind of thing at the beginning of the story, and then they go and they attack this island and rescue the old X-Men, and then that becomes the basis for the team that is then in the book going forward. And we see some characters like Cyclops from the original X-Men is also involved in the story, and he becomes a regular member of the team going forward and the team leader. But we see some characters that existed but were not well developed, like Wolverine. I'm sure we'll talk quite a bit about Wolverine
Oh, yes,
is
definitely.
included. Then some characters that are created for this process. Colossus, who is a Russian Soviet farm boy who turns into metal and is super strong and resistant to damage. We have Storm, who is a Kenyan weather controlling mutant. We have Nightcrawler, who is a German um, circus performer who's fuzzy, looks like the devil, and can teleport and hide in shadows.
Hmm.
Thunderbird, who is a Native American with strength. I don't remember his other powers as being much more than that.
Sort of a
Um,
chip on his shoulder.
oh yeah, he's got an attitude, man. And then in Sunfire also has a chip. There's a lot of chips on the shoulders. Wolverine has
Yes.
chips on the shoulders. Thunderbird has chips on the
A
shoulder.
lot of disgruntled superheroes.
Yes, Sunfire, who was a pre-existing character, is a mutant from Japan who has fire-based powers and can fly. Did I forget anybody in that list?
Banshee?
Banshee is another pre-existing character, Irish, who can scream and fly and blast people with sound. So, as I've detailed, one of the things interesting about it, as opposed to the original X-Men, is it's much more diverse, sort of culturally diverse. There's still only the one female,
Right.
Storm, although Jean Grey, the Marvel Girl, hangs around and becomes part of the new team as well. But certainly more culturally and ethnically diverse than the original all white, mostly all dude
Right.
original X-Men.
Yeah. Including
Did
somebody
I
from the
miss
Soviet
anything?
Union that which I
Yes. Oh, which is pretty crazy for 1975.
yeah. No,
Um,
yeah, you got everybody there. So this was the kind of the interesting thing that I guess you did some research and found out that when Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum started the new X-Men
yes.
series, that they kind of just had free reign because Marvel didn't care.
Yeah, so I don't remember if I found out exactly why they decided to do the Giant Size X-Men #1. I did read that there was initially a plan for it to be a quarterly book
Mhm.
rather than a monthly title or a bi-monthly title originally. And that Claremont was relatively new in Marvel, and that it was not it was seen as not a plum assignment to get this book. So nobody was like jealous that he got the X-Men, and
Right.
then he and Cockrum really took it and ran with it. And it became, as you say, a substantially important a comic of the '70s and the '80s. It really
Yeah.
kind of, I think, helped sort of usher in kind of that renaissance into the '80s in
Oh
comic
yeah,
books.
definitely, definitely. So I kind of said before that this was, a revival. Was there ever like another sort of big revival like this before in comics? Where they really just kind of revamped it totally. Certainly there were characters who had evolved. Like we talked a lot about Batman
Yeah,
becoming a more serious character, and
I
Superman resisting any
that's
efforts
right.
to change
That's
the
right.
character. But it
I
felt like at the time, like this was like the biggest
I think
change
this is
ever.
like, yeah, because changes otherwise. I mean, sure, the Avengers changed their lineup on a regular basis. That's the closest I can come up with,
Yeah,
especially when you went from the original Avengers to like when it was, Captain America and Hawkeye and
Scarlet
Cap's
Witch, and
Quartet or whatever they called it,
yeah,
the Vision. Um, that's as close as I can think of. Now, later, and we'll talk about this. There ones that come later. I think I'll leave that for discussion later. But there are examples, and we talked about it with Batman. There was a
hmm
substantial renaissance of Batman in the Middle Ages,
right,
but this is well before. This is a decade before that. So I think this really is to really take an existing property like that and just take some elements of the old version, but like add a whole bunch of new elements. I can't think of a similar example.
yeah. And this kind of answers, I think, one of the biggest problems that any sort of serialized entertainment has, which is over time things become stale.
Yes.
I use that adjective to describe a lot of the superhero comics at the time that the
Hmm.
X-Men started this revival. And sometimes what you do, what are your choices if you're in charge of a TV show or a comic book? Comic books have to come out every month. TV shows have to come out, as long as, you're in regular season, every week. What do you do? Do you just kind of go back to basics? Just keep doing the same things, only more so. Try to make it seem fresh, or capture whatever that lightning in a bottle was that made something initially popular. I think that's maybe the hardest thing to do.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So instead, you want to have some sort of departure, but as you said, you want to have some things that are familiar and some things that are really genuinely new. And that
That's right.
mix is what they really pulled off with this. And it wasn't just the characters, too. It was also
Right.
just
No.
doing long story arcs and other aspects that we'll talk about.
So what I need to ask though before we move on, are you pitching the new Ancient Geeks? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, we're going to face that problem eventually,
But
and
no, I think
my idea for that is like one of us turns out to be evil,
sure.
and we don't know which one yet,
That's
listeners.
that's right. Wait and find
Stephen.
out. I am the one with the beard.
Yes, there you go. All right.
I used to have a goatee, so we can work on it.
I can do a pretty good Joker laugh.
There you go. So
Okay,
we'll keep them guessing.
we'll
No,
keep them
I
guessing.
think that it is. Look, I read all. So what I mean, for clarity's sake, right? We're looking at basically issue what 94, is that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Through 109,
Yeah.
which is all Claremont and Cockrum, and then two of the John Byrne issues. And we plan to talk about John Byrne separately in another episode. But um, what struck me, well, I may be getting ahead of myself, but it was. I'll amplify what you just said. I think that it seemed fresh. Not only did it have these
hmm
elements from the past, but I mean, some of it's like even Cyclops's visor looks cooler in the new version. So some of it's like little tweaks,
Yeah.
but then some of it is, it's a different kind of storytelling than I think was previously the case
Right.
in a lot of comics. Like you say, long Claremont liked long, complicated story arcs that had multiple plot points that might not get resolved for
hmm
months, maybe even
Right.
years in some cases. Um, this team is different than, I mean, there was fighting in the Avengers, but not, this is, again, lots of chips on the shoulders and a
Yeah.
lot of like clearly like difficult conflicts within the X-Men, um, and just different kinds of characters, right? It does
Right.
feel a little bit like, um, a refresh on just comics in general at this point, right?
Yeah. And kind of the outstandingly different character is Wolverine, who,
Hmm.
so first of all, he and Banshee, we mentioned, had been in other comics, but like, one appearance, two appearances, maybe at most, that these are characters who are almost new. right? You could say they were already part of the Marvel universe, but
I
effectively, kind of making them regular characters was novel for those
mean, I'm
for those.
pretty sure, and I didn't look up Banshee. I did Banshee not? Did he not appear in the Neil Adams run of the X-Men, or am I forgetting?
I forgot which ones it was, but he was in the X-Men as a villain
Okay,
originally.
that's right. He was a villain originally. That's correct.
Yeah,
And I'm fairly sure, although I'm sure someone can correct us. I know that Wolverine premiered in the Hulk,
right.
and I'm not sure he was ever anything after that. Was
No,
he?
he never showed up anywhere
Yeah, I
else.
didn't think so either.
Yeah, where the Hulk battled the
The
Wendigo.
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 And that, again, as an early collector, and I mean, God knows what it actually cost for 13-year-old me. It seemed like a fortune, but I know like the issue where Wolverine appears was like one of these like hugely expensive issues to
Oh
get
yeah, yeah.
because no one kept it because no one thought, what's this goofy cat-looking guy who jumps out from behind a rock?
Right, and it just happened to be in Canada, I
Yeah,
think, was
that's
was
right.
so that you had a Canadian villain,
Yes,
the flesh-eating monster, the Wendigo, and
yes,
then you had the Canadian superhero they introduced, Wolverine. And even like almost like right away in the revamped X-Men, he was defined as sort of at one end of a continuum of violence from, let's say, Cyclops. It's
yes.
like,
But
so there's
clearly
that. So, yeah,
he's
so
violent, though. I mean, the basic point, he clearly is violent. And let's face facts. I mean, he's got six razor sharp claws
right.
that he's using, so it's not exactly
Yeah, he's not a team player.
no.
He, has I think it was like during this time, like he has an attraction for Jean Grey,
It
that
does,
then
yeah.
kind of sets up conflict with Scott Summers' Cyclops.
Yes,
You just had again sort of like these interesting built-in sorts of interpersonal relationships, some healthy, some unhealthy,
yes,
and also sort of philosophical differences sometimes too.
yes,
Like you
yes.
have people, kind of critiquing Cyclops' leadership. Why did you make that decision? Shouldn't we have done something else? Which I don't, recall that much in other comics.
No, I agree. And the thing that struck me about Cyclops, and I remember him being all broody, but boy, he is
Yeah,
broody in this era. And just yeah, not fun, not great fun at parties, Cyclops.
yeah. So, what did you think, kind of rereading it, about the multinational aspects of it?
So I mean, I mean, obviously I was aware of it at the time. It just seemed normal at the time. I think what struck me about it this time, as I kind of alluded to earlier, was because I went back and I have not read all the Lee and Kirby X-Men. I've read some of them.
Hmm.
And excuse me, but it was striking, especially the first issue of the very first issue of the X-Men. And it's basically what it's Angel, Iceman, Cyclops, Beast. That may be it.
Jean
I may be
Grey.
forgetting somebody. Well, I was thinking of the dudes. So
Oh, the dudes.
there's four dudes. They're four white dudes. They're very kind of like Ivy
Bland.
League broy, like bland
Oh
people, and then
yeah,
they're
yeah,
all like all excited because there's going to be a girl. Um, it's just and so it was striking having read that, and then he basically read the first couple of issues of the original run, and then skipping to Giant Size number one. And oh, we're like collecting a much more varied team. And I think one of the things that was interesting about it too, from a story point of view, that fit the broader mutant
Mhm.
Xavier narrative is like, yeah, you're supposed to be looking all over the place. The whole point of this school is to find mutants, and they're not all going to be in, the northeastern United States. So
Yeah,
maybe that all makes sense, right?
yeah.
Um, so, well, did you have some thoughts about that?
Not big ones. I just remember at the time thinking it was pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah,
At times, they maybe Claremont overdid it a little bit.
sure.
Just you didn't necessarily have to be constantly reminded that Colossus was from the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
just like he'd
And
have some anecdote about back on the collective farm. You know? But it
there
was
was a
fun that
certain
like when he spoke in Russian, they
yeah,
used
yeah,
Cyrillic lettering.
yeah.
Yeah,
Especially
that was
early
kind of
on,
cool.
I did
Yeah,
notice that. I'd forgotten that because usually it was the typical just put them in brackets when they're speaking in the language. But
yeah,
I did notice that Cyrillic, and then of course same with Nightcrawler, lots of German words
yeah.
and that sort of thing.
Unglaublich.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Better you saying it than me. I will not say it correctly. Um,
Yeah. So anyway, so there during this run, there was this, as we've already said, you know, kind of this interesting mix of old and new, including with the villains. So, you know, of course, they had to do Magneto,
oh yeah.
the kind of the chief X-Men villain, and they also had the Sentinels, the
Yes.
mutant hunting robots, and I thought that was a interesting run. You know, when they brought back the Sentinels
Yes.
with kind of a new person behind them.
Yeah.
You know, the Juggernaut, you know, that was a character that was from the original X-Men, but and also like a ton of these really again undermined characters, you know, more obscure,
Yes.
but they would bring them back. So I made a little list here. So
Okay.
aside from Magneto, Juggernaut, and the Sentinels, you also had Eric the Red,
Yes.
uh, which was an odd. I'm saying odd too much again. It was an
But at least
interesting
it's not
choice.
wacky.
Yeah, but like very little known. It was kind of a quirky thing that
Yes.
happened. That it was actually Cyclops in villain garb. There was this alien race, the Xenox, Count Nefaria. Uh, anyway, these really minor characters, and then they threw in all these new things.
Yes.
You know, as we already talked about the heroes, but you also had Black Tom
Hmm.
as a villain, the Krakoa, the island that's actually a gigantic mutant that sucks mutant energy from other mutants. You know, other things too that just were brand new, and so like it felt like you could never tell what curve the comic was going to throw you.
No, I think yeah, it was a little more sophisticated than some previous storytelling had been. I think
Yeah,
that's and I think
versus
Claremont's just a really good writer.
yeah, and it's like instead of like reading Spider-Man, it's like, okay, well, who in the rotation of Spider-Man villains is going to show up now? Is it going to be the
Right.
Rhino, the
Right.
Scorpion, the Kingpin? Oh, look, it's the Shocker. For those who don't know, not the best supervillain. I think that
His power is it's static electricity, right? He walks on the carpet and shocks you.
there you go. Exactly. He's just annoying,
That's right.
right? Yeah. Um, so the other things that were really interesting about the series at the time was the long story arc
Yes.
that they set up. And so there would be multi-issue plots, just like Black Tom and Juggernaut are these villains, and they're out to get the X-Men, and there are family connections to Professor X and Banshee involved. But also, then there is this sinister other force in the background who is kind of set them on this particular course to oppose the X-Men. And that's part of this slowly unraveling or slowly revealed plot line that culminates around the time that Dave Cockrum
Yes.
finishes his first run on the X-Men.
Well, I didn't write it down, but I mean the whole vision of Lilandra that Xavier has is like really early in this run,
Oh
and
yeah.
it takes a long time to pay off.
Mhm. Yeah, so as it turns out, a lot of the shenanigans that are happening with these other villains are the result of a civil war in this newly introduced alien empire in the X-Men, the Shi'ar. What's the official
You know,
pronunciation?
I think it's Shi'ar. I think it's Shi'ar. Yeah,
Shi'ar?
I
Okay.
think yeah.
I always thought it was Shi'ar, but okay.
I think that's what I always thought, and I'm pretty sure when I saw the comic cartoon, that's what they said. I
Hey,
think
I'm not a Shi'ar, so I'm happy to respect
that's
however they
that's
describe
that's
themselves.
right. They're bird people.
Yes. So that was kind of a big deal, actually,
Yeah, it
that you
was.
had something that was that long running, a storyline, and tied everything together that had happened. And then you had this big culmination in where the villains are revealed, this alien empress or deposed empress shows up that Professor X has been having visions of, and they're pulled into this civil war that also might end the universe.
Yes, that's right. And you get a whole panoply of characters introduced. You get the entire Imperial Guard, which
You mean
of
the
course
Legion of
is
Superheroes?
that's what I was about to say, yes. And you get the Starjammers.
Yeah,
So you got all these characters. It's actually very crowded at one point. Keeping track of who's who is hard,
yeah.
but interesting.
Okay, so I have to comment on something because it came up in an earlier episode of
Okay.
Ancient Geeks. So the problem here that's threatening the whole universe is that there's some magic dingus that the bad guys have that and the leader of which is completely insane that
Yes.
causes the universe to blink out of existence
Yes.
temporarily. Does that remind you of anything?
I just remember what it reminds me of. Yeah.
The
Yeah. Your,
alternative
your
factor.
favorite Star Trek episode.
Yes, my
Yes.
yes. My I think I think that X that you said favorite, you put like a one and a slash and you put the X underneath. It's
Yes.
the worst episode. Clearly inspired by the alternative factor.
Oh, there's no doubt that Claremont and Cockrum are both are Star Trek fans.
Yes.
Like when the Shi'ar people first show up, it's clearly a homage to the Enterprise bridge.
Right. Yes.
But yes, I did not know it did not occur to me until you said that with the Ultra's crystals or whatever the hell they were going to destroy the universe.
Yeah.
I
So
can't
what
remember
so
what they were called.
so what else struck you as being fresh and new about this this run of comics?
So I think I was looking at some of the art, and while Cockrum is not my favorite X-Men artist, we'll get to that later. Um, when you look at the pages, I read the stuff on the Marvel app now. I don't have all these comics, but I have quite a few of them upstairs. But when you look, at first I was reading it, where you do the zooms each panel,
Hmm.
and then there are a couple of very big splash pages, so I started looking at them as individual pages, and really, Cockrum does some pretty cool stuff, even with the panels on the page. Very kinetic. A
Hmm.
lot's going on. Now, Cockrum's art, I find that when he's drawing people, like if it's at a distance,
Hmm.
he's a little simplistic, but there is what I might want to call the Cockrum close-up. He does these
Oh yeah.
very, very detailed, like one person's head right in the frame of the comic panel. And he loves drawing Cyclops because they're like so much better those close-ups than the distance shots, so to speak. So I think that was dynamic, and again, we and the it was expansive. I mean, there's already quite a bit of cosmic and galactic stuff in Marvel Comics, but this really expanded and created more of it, and it persists to this day as I have done research on the Shi'ar. Um, but it was just, it was a dynamic story process, I think.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I would also say something that really struck me at the time, and everybody I think who was reading it as it came out was that really soon, just like a few issues into the new X-Men, one of the X-Men dies.
That's right.
That was really genuinely a shocker. The issue itself said, in this issue, an X-Man dies, and he didn't come back, right? It wasn't a fake death. It wasn't.
Until apparently he comes back. He came back in 2022,
Yeah, I know that
but it took a while. But
inevitably, yeah,
unlike some other X deaths we might talk about at some point,
right,
uh,
exactly.
he
Yeah,
uh, he stays dead for a very long time.
yeah,
And yeah, that was I think it would have impacted you more than me. Because I came at it backwards, so it wasn't quite the same impact. But yeah, it's one of the few examples that I can think of early on of a character that dies, and just that was the consequence of the adventure that week, and or that month, he's dead.
Yeah. And it was totally in character for the
Yes.
guy.
Yeah.
Uh, the way that he died.
It was the weight of the chip on his shoulder that, no, that's not true.
Exactly.
Crushed him. But yeah, you're correct. Yes, it was in character. He was stubborn,
Yes.
and it got him killed.
Yeah. Anything else really grab you about these comics?
I think we've covered the basics, and we can talk maybe about some specific stuff. Um,
Yeah, I just want to throw in just like how really big a sensation this was. I mean,
yeah,
it
yeah,
really did take comic fandom by storm at the moment, at the moment this happened, so that it became instantly the comic everybody wanted to read. I
right.
mean, having the comic shop, people come in and, that's what they were subscribing to. That's what they wanted to chat with, whether they're to fellow fans who happened to be in the store. It also seemed to have an effect on some of the other titles, not
Oh,
just
yeah,
Marvel, but also
definitely.
DC. There happened to be like a little bit more interpersonal conflict sometimes with
Yes.
like the Avengers. It seemed like the quality of writing in some of the other comics got a little better. I don't know if that was like consciously trying to up their game or people trying to emulate the
Right.
success of the X-Men.
I mean, it's a good question, and it would be thoroughly theoretical, but or kind of a guess. But it would seem that yes, if this is what led to the success, and let's try to emulate this success.
Yes.
And again, as you said, the period at that moment was a little stagnant, so this helps put a jolt of energy into it. I'll say it this way too, and I've already made this reference, or a reference to this fact, but I think it matters for maybe why I'm not thinking about this in quite the same way. I really, like I said, I came to serious comic collecting 80, 81. So at this point, this has all happened already.
Yeah.
And for a 12 to 13-year-old, 1975, 6 years prior, 5 years prior, seemed like, oh my God, that's like ancient history practically.
Yeah.
So I was catching up with it. I was, like I said, I know I got enough into the X-Men that by the time the Wolverine miniseries came out in later 82, I was deeply into it at that point. So it's also funny how you realize how you can go from 0 to 60 at that when you're young. Because I think I was reading Fantastic Four, and in fact I think maybe that's part of what led me to the Byrne stuff because I really liked his Fantastic Four. Um,
Hmm.
oh, this is what John Byrne did before the Fantastic Four was in my mind, right?
Right. Right.
And I was reading the Avengers and some other comic series before I got into this, and then the X-Men stuff hits really hard. But really, I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that again, when you're in your 50s, 6, 7 years, what's the big deal? But
Yeah.
from 1975 to 1982, how much that entire franchise explodes, and by the time you get to that Wolverine miniseries, it is like it's central to the Marvel universe and to the publishing industry, right?
Right. For decades.
For decades, indeed, and still is in many ways. And we won't talk about it today, but I mean, it spawns a bunch of movies and a bunch of other things that are, I think, quite
Yeah.
significant. And in some ways, I mean, we're about to see what happens when the MCU is able to get its hands on these characters, and what
Hmm.
that may or may not mean. But regardless, I'll leave that for a future episode. I will point out, right? So when you talk about the impact, the first thing that I think about is the new Teen Titans, which
Right.
is then the same kind of revival with the same kind of sort of highly talented writer, artist,
Hmm.
revamping characters, new characters, and then following on from that. And it did occur to me, although again they happened pretty rapidly, but there are elements as I was rereading this first Shi'ar story. There are elements that remind me very much of some of the stuff with Starfire and the New Teen Titans.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's from another planet, and there's the sisters taking over, and there's a conflict, and like the Omega Men remind me somewhat of the Starjammers and stuff like that. So I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
there's a lot of, and to be fair, right, the original X-Men are probably a copy of the was it the Doom Patrol maybe, or I'm thinking of I'm getting that wrong. There was a DC comic that
Yeah, there was Doom
Yeah,
Patrol
Doom
and
Patrol.
Challengers of the
Challenge
Unknown,
in the
and
Zone, that there was some very
yeah,
similar. There were some similarities. They stole from one another all the time, and that's
right.
fine. But
Well, for those
um,
listening who don't know the Teen Titans, it was DC Comics super team of sidekicks.
yes,
So it was Robin, Aqualad,
Kid
uh,
Flash,
Kid Flash, Wonder Girl,
Speedy.
Speedy, Green Arrow's sidekick.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so, it was never a big hit when it came
No.
out in the 60s. And it seemed like one of the least likely things to ever generate the kind of
Yes.
popularity that under Marv Wolfman and George Perez as the author artist team eventually succeeded at.
Oh yeah. I mean, the I reread a couple years ago uh, all the Perez run on New Teen Titans, and it's really, really good.
Yeah,
And his art is fantastic, and the stories are more sophisticated. But it is very much clearly that became DC's X-Men
right.
at this particular point in time. And then, although it faded in ways that the X-Men didn't,
Yeah.
it's still important, but it's not what it was.
But it was and certainly the X-Men inspired, I
Oh,
think, a
yeah.
lot of creativity about coming at old characters in a very different way. And again, it kind of preserving that balance of the old and the new.
Yes, agreed.
So what else would you say is kind of the legacy of this time period? I
I
think the
mean,
long
this
story
was,
arcs was
yes,
one,
long story arcs. Of course, eventually it leads to a huge proliferation of books. It was, it's at tail end of the era where, how to put it? So I'll work backwards. By the time we get to the 90s, even the mid late 80s,
Mhm.
they're overproducing these comics. And they know that, 14-year-old me is like, oh, if I buy the number one issue, it'll be worth something at some point. Well, no, it won't,
Right.
because it's like that's not how it works. If they've overproduced them, or if people already know they want something. Like I read, and I don't know, I didn't double check this if the source that I had is accurate, but like X-Men number one, the premier direct market shiny paper version that came out in the early 1990s
Yeah.
was apparently the biggest selling comic of all time. Which that tells us, of course, is there are lots of copies of X-Men number one out there. Therefore, it's
Mm.
not worth as much as something else. I mean, why is the Superman's first appearance worth so much money? Because everyone's mom threw the comic away and no one knew it was worth keeping, right? I mean,
Right.
it's supply and demand. So I think, but the X-Men really, I think it fueled a lot of collectors trying to then come back and get these back issues. Like I was trying to get all the Burn issues. It was a big deal to me. And some of the earlier ones as well, up until not from 94 onward. So there's a whole host of us my age that at first, understood comic collecting is like there's this rarity you have to go back and find. But then because X-Men were so popular and other books were so popular, they just began producing more and more and more of them, right? Well, again, to your family's business, right? Comic shops, there weren't comic shops in 1960, I would suspect, but they were in the 70s and 80s, and they had to sell stuff, and so there's just more
Hmm.
of it. And I think the X-Men helped drive that forward very, very much.
Yeah, definitely. There did eventually were way too many X books.
Oh, there
But
were. I mean, it just became impossible. I mean, but wasn't just the X-Men. Same thing happened with Batman,
right,
Spider-Man. Um,
right.
but
It
yeah,
became too
so many X-Books.
complicated, and
Hmm.
yeah, that's another problem with doing serialized entertainment is that you just kind of often get to the point where the subplots and backstories and interconnections are so complicated that it's hard for new people to get into it.
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's very difficult. I mean, like we've discussed before in passing on the podcast, when we try to go now and try to figure out how to pick up some of these characters that we haven't read for years, trying to figure out the entry point is very, very difficult.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about, again, this is still the early 80s. You start with the miniseries like Wolverine, not to get way off on this tangent, but the Wolverine, there was some other X-Men had miniseries. That was back when they would do these four story runs before they decide, hey, we could just sell a monthly comic. It's,
yeah.
and then there was the first big one was the New Mutants, right? That
Hmm.
was trying to like recapture this idea of the school and youngsters. Then you get
Yeah.
X Factor, which is the original X-Men, and it just goes from there, just proliferates.
Pretending not to be mutants.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
was that was an interesting premise.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What about favorite issues of this run of
This
the
run.
X-Men? Yeah.
So the ones that I wrote down, it's maybe unfair to the whole run, but it was the last three that we looked at, 107, 108, 109, which is really the
Right.
culmination of the Shi'ar story. And actually, one of those is a Byrne issue, not a Cockrum issue. And the 109 may be my favorite one of this entire run because I like the whole weapon alpha story, and the whole alpha fight stuff. Something's always been one of my favorite little side plots. But the 107 and 108, big fights, lots of characters, culminating of all these things we talked about, even explain the Eric the Red thing, which is being a Shi'ar agent, and all of the entire story gets wrapped up. Those are my favorite ones. I mean, I'll say I enjoyed anything with the Sentinels.
Yeah.
Magneto's always fun, and of course there's the whole, which we haven't talked about at all, the premiere of Phoenix in issue 101.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit because that was a story arc within a story arc. Like
Yes,
as they were resolving the one about the Shi'ar Empire,
yes,
then they introduced this one about Phoenix, which I
yes,
think if people have been to the movies and seen, the depictions of that in a couple of movies,
yes,
where Jean Grey suddenly starts to take this very brutal turn and becomes a cosmic threat. That was started in this period, and again,
yes.
a very slow burn.
A very slow burn, a very, very slow
Yeah,
burn. Because it starts in issue 101 that she helps save them from crashing space shuttle, and she gets exposed to radiation. Radiation, what to your point from a couple episodes ago, what can it do? And it and
yes,
somehow she acquires this new power, which we later find out is an entity, but it's a whole long thing. But this is the beginning. All really it is during this run from this Dave Cockrum era is Marvel Girl, who was a psychic and a telekinetic, or a telepath and a telekinetic, is now has these much more expanded powers, which she doesn't fully
yeah,
understand. And they're growing. They'll become a big deal during the burn era that we'll talk about later. But yeah, it's a slow burn from that point forward. And so she becomes, and it all ties in with the Shi'ar stuff later as well. But it was definitely a really important element of Marvel Comics of this era.
yeah. Yeah, and again, I think that this I don't want to give like credit for everything in geek culture that's serialized, kind of mastering a particular sort of story arc format to the X-Men, but certainly like the people who did Babylon 5, Buffy, other shows that or comics could, if they read the X-Men, they saw at least a template for how you juggle like incidental stories with the bigger storyline. So
Yes,
you
so
didn't burn through really quickly, right? So you had, okay, so Magneto shows up, they fight for a couple of issues. In the meantime, there's this Phoenix, problem that started, or there's the Shi'ar Empire problem that they're still in the middle of struggling with. That was a kind of a tricky balance to do that the X-Men always pulled off, even when they were juggling multiple story arcs.
yes. No, I think that's totally fair. I mean, and Babylon 5, I didn't think about that. It's a great comparison because Babylon 5 is a story that starts seeding in elements of the overall plot very early on, so much so that you don't realize it until later that this was
Yeah,
important. This thing was important, or that character was important, or whatever the case may be. I mean, the Phoenix thing starts in issue 101 and does not resolve itself until 137.
yeah.
That's a pretty remarkable amount of time for a comic book to like slow burn something.
Yeah,
As
and
we,
it was there was a tension there, as you said, she wasn't able to figure out what her problems,
yeah,
sorry, what her powers were or where they really came from. Eventually she learned it, but yeah, seemed like also that maybe she wasn't totally in control of what she
right,
was doing
right.
always. And that was a bit menacing. So there was always tension there, even though the pace of revelation of what was actually going on was very gradual.
Agreed. What were your favorite issues in this run?
So I would say the Sentinels. I didn't put
Hmm.
that in my list originally, but you reminded me of that. I thought that was really good because it also, I think, was a good example of how the the new X series really cranked up a notch the whole sort of theme in the X-Men about the conflict between mutants and ordinary humans.
Right.
And that there were deranged people on both sides of that conflict, as well
Yeah.
as people who were trying to just coexist reasonably with one another. So I thought the Black Tom and Juggernaut series was
Hmm.
pretty good. I really enjoyed those. It was a kind of a good couple of issue 1-2 punch kind of
Hmm.
comic book story that was really good. And then the finale with the Shi'ar
Hmm.
Shi'ar Empire was great.
Yeah, it was really good stuff.
Yeah, it paid off. All that build up paid off.
Yeah, it did. That's always very satisfying.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on the X-Men before we wrap up?
I think we've hit all of the highlights that I thought we hit and then some, so I'm good.
Okay. All right. So our usual wrapping up question, what merch did you have?
So, I mean, for the most part, the merch was just more comics, right?
Yes.
And it was the quest for, oh, the issues that I don't have. I do have, in fact, they're hanging here in my little workroom studio. I have some pin back buttons, but they're a little later. They're Paul Smith art, but it's all the X-Men. So I have stuff like that. I may have had some posters that I acquired over the years. Beyond that, nothing else. Just lots of comics.
Yeah, I really didn't have anything. Again, you said the comics were effectively the
Hmm.
merch. But also, too, I think this is a good way of illustrating the fact that there was still a cleavage between geek culture and mainstream culture.
Hmm.
Yeah, that on the one hand, here this was a phenomenon in the comics world, the new X-Men, but it didn't even like merit doing the typical sort of merch, action figures,
Right.
t-shirts, those sorts of things, bed sheets.
Get your Wolverine bed sheets.
Did you ever have bed sheets of any IP?
The only bed sheet that I had a couple, they were pillow slips only. They were Snoopy pillow slips. That's the only
Okay.
thing. Never
Okay.
had any like Star Wars or none of that stuff.
Yeah,
That's
neither
the
did I. Neither did I.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that might have been a bridge too far for for geekery.
I never
Uh,
really like, oh, I've got to have a Star Wars bed. I never just never
yeah, why
really
would you want to have to sleep with
I don't know.
Star Wars or the X-Men or whatever? Anyway, I never understood that personally, but hey, I who am I to judge
That's
people's
right.
fetishes? Anyway,
I was thinking about, yeah, you do have the black and white queen in the Hellfire Club that some people might want bed sheets of, but that's a whole different conversation.
yeah, let's not go there yet. Okay, what merch did you wish you had?
I think early on, I was still young enough that I liked action figures, and I think I probably would have liked to have had some X-Men action figures.
Yeah. I would have loved to have a Cyclops visor, the new visor,
Yeah.
the bigger version, especially if it had like a red light in it. I
Hmm.
mean, that would have made a terrific Halloween costume. Like then to just come up with a scratch built
Yeah.
X Cyclops costume around that.
I always thought, even when I first encountered it, like how lame the original visor was compared to the new one.
Yeah,
It's like, it was just like a little, almost a, I don't know, very small.
yeah, it was just a
But
slit.
yeah, the new one's like that looks like something that could be a problem.
Right. And when I didn't want to interact with anybody in my family, I could wear that,
Well,
you know. Are you listening to me? Of course I am. Yes. Pay no attention to the fact that I'm wearing this visor.
that's right. That's right.
All right. Well, that's a good point to wrap up
Yes,
on the X-Men. So thanks for everybody listening, and we'll see you with some more X coverage in the future.
that's right.
And so we reach the triumphant conclusion of another episode of Ancient Geeks. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe if you like what you hear, and leave us a review on whatever the podcast service of your choice happens to be. If you want to reach us directly, contact us at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us on Reddit, Facebook, Blue Sky, and other social media outlets. All content copyright 2025, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. See you next time.